Hello, Shemai, and welcome back to Spare a Thought. I'm your host, Tom Spare. In each episode of this podcast, I interview interesting people and organisations who are doing important work in areas of society that are often misrepresented or underreported in the media. We're now into season 2 of the podcast. It's been really heartening to hear all the positive feedback of the episodes we've made so far. You can listen to season 1 wherever you found this episode. In the episodes ahead, we'll be focusing primarily on Wales. Why? Well, because there are very few podcasts centred on contemporary Wales. We'll be covering topics like Welsh women's football, the state of higher education in Wales, and we'll also be asking ourselves important questions like how can we empower diverse communities? And we'll be looking at the Welsh media landscape too. In addition to our Wales-focused episodes, we'll also be exploring living with long COVID, entrepreneurship, and doing business for the social good. Today, we're kicking things off with a discussion about Welsh identity, devolution, and the future of Wales. After all, we've just recently celebrated St. David's Day, which took place on the 1st of March. St. David's Day is a really good opportunity to reflect on Welshness, Welsh identity, and everything else that goes with it. My guest today is Gwern Gwynfil. Gwern grew up in Tregaron, a small town in mid-Wales. He attended Jesus College, Oxford, studying history. He served as the first CEO of Yes Cymru, Wales's independence campaign group. He's now the acting director of New Wales, a Welsh cross-party think tank. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure you will too. So let's get into it and spare a thought for Welsh identity, devolution, and the future of Wales.
Hi, I'm Gwern Gwynfil, and I'm here to talk to Tom today, and I'm really looking forward to it. I am the acting director of New Wales, Cymru Newydd.
What was your experience of St. David's Day growing up? And what's the experience of your kids with St. David's Day? And is there a difference between those two experiences, do you think?
So in the mechanics of it, not necessarily that much of a difference. You know, people get dressed up in the same kind of outfits. St. David's Day, dydd Gwrdewi is observed and noticed. People tend to wear daffodils now exclusively, whereas when I was small, particularly in teenage years, the boys were very keen on wearing leeks. Big, massive leeks, and then to really annoy people, chew on them all day and breathe all over people, which was, you know, I don't think so much of that happens anymore. So in that sense, I would say the only thing that's different is that it's more observed now. So you know, as we've had the assembly, which is now the Senedd, there's a little bit more awareness and there's more confidence in embracing our Welsh culture and heritage. And it's in that sense that it has changed. It's in the attitude surrounding it that it has changed. So when I was young, there was still a lot of antipathy between the various parts of the Welsh communities. You know, there was a lot of defensiveness in the Welsh-speaking community because they felt that they were under constant attack. And there was a lot of defensiveness in the non-Welsh-speaking Welsh community because they felt that the Welsh-speaking community thought they were better than they were. And you had these splits that were quite deep and encouraged by external forces. You know, those wedge issues which can be played upon politically for political advantage and gain. And much of that has disappeared. And, you know, it's not just me saying that or feeling that in my own life. The data supports that. There was a very interesting poll out again, which reinforces a similar poll about a year ago and another similar poll about 2 years ago, showing that, you know, only 20% of Wales now have a negative perception of the Welsh language. It's pretty consistently, take out the don't knows, and you're pretty consistently up to 4/5 of Wales are supportive of the Welsh language and feel some sense of ownership of it. And I do think that for the Welsh-speaking community, some of whom can still be very defensive about things, they really need, and I was arguing this when in my 20s, very unpopularly, I could say. But I used to argue this quite strongly because if we want people to embrace our culture and embrace our language, we have to embrace them and we have to share those things with them. We can't hold it to ourselves. You know, we can't keep it as some kind of exclusive treasure for us or for the Welsh-speaking heartlands of Wales. We have to give it to everyone and really encourage them to embrace it as their own without any expectation of them necessarily learning to speak the language, and surprisingly, when there's no expectation, you'll find that more and more people will actually make the effort, even if it is just to say diolch yn fawr, shwmae, and be really proud of themselves when they do so. And we should give them that and really embrace the fact that they want to do that. And that's been a massive change. I mean, a huge change. I mean, we're nowhere near the levels of confidence we should have as a nation. You know, we're not like Iceland. I mean, if you want to see what a confident nation is like, talk to an Icelandic person. I'm speaking to an Icelandic journalist, actually, a chap called Helgi. And I remember asking him, Helgi, could you put a man on the moon? And he went, yes, of course. And then I saw him pause and think, and he turned to me and he said, why would we want to? It's not, no, I can't do it. No, don't be silly. It's, of course we could if we wanted to, but there's no point because, we don't want to do that. And that's not a conversation you could ever have with a Welsh person. It should be.
Yeah. And because I remember watching a talk with Laura McAllister, and she was talking about small poppy syndrome and Welsh confidence and I suppose we can talk about this in a minute but the metrics, there's a lot of negative metrics that we can say about Wales in terms of education outcomes, but also how it punches above its weight in a lot of areas, which can be quite surprising too, and has the potential for growth in those strengths. But also in the Welsh language, when I first came to Wales over a decade ago, I did feel a pressure. I was nervous about even trying to speak the Welsh language. Even in the basic stuff, boh-reh or pnaoon or nos-wye-th, that's changed over time, and I think it has become, even in the years that I've been here, more integrated into wider society. There's been lots about signs on roads and signage generally, but even just hearing it around announcements for the train, which can be a bit disorientating to start with when you first arrive. When I first arrived in Cardiff, not sure, I'm having to wait a little bit to work out where I need to go.
Every time you come to Wales, it's like going on a proper holiday, if that's the case.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was like, there's sort of multiple languages going on here. This is amazing, So even I've observed a shift, I think, and a confidence there. And also, I suppose it's the longer the fact I call it home now, and I've got lots of friends around me who are Welsh and who, some of whom have kids who are sharing stories about, their kids are Welsh speakers and they don't necessarily speak Welsh, but that's amazing. It's an investment in the future and a confidence there that they'll have, and a skill that then unlocks that opportunity to learn other languages too, because obviously once you learn another language, then you're able to build other skills.
Yeah. My grandfather was a professor of education in Aberystwyth University, and sadly he died when I was about 3. But one of his passions and one of his main work streams was to travel across Europe, crisscross Europe, and help set up various long-term studies with enormous cohorts, some cohorts of over 100,000, of the impacts of bilingual education on lifelong outcomes. And many of those have been reporting in the last few decades. And what all of that data is showing very clearly and very categorically is that a bilingual education gives you enormous benefits throughout your life. Absolutely enormous. And the younger that can start, the better. So if you can grow up with 2 languages before you're 5 years old, the impacts of that and they're massive. They're massive positive outcomes across life. And it was really interesting that in the 90s, when those studies were halfway through, they appeared to show that there were detrimental impacts, particularly in teenage years, and that people who were growing up speaking 2 languages were having lower educational attainments around the age of GCSEs for us in this country. And obviously there was a huge amount of anti-Welsh stuff which picked up on this. But as that cohort progressed and went through, by the time they got to 18, 19, 20, they were all outperforming their monoglot peers who had been outperforming them 3 or 4 years earlier, because their minds had finally sorted out that extra language issue, and suddenly they now had more elasticity, more skills. They were much better at thinking laterally and creatively. And those studies now, I mean, it's categorical. It's a bit like the climate change, man-made climate change argument. You've got 1 or 2 people who might argue against this enormous body of data, but that kind of bilingual education is a huge plus. And for me in Wales, it's one of our failures particularly in the education sector, to have not made that argument and made it clear to the people of Wales that all 500,000 of our children in Wales should be having a fully bilingual education from the age of 2. And we should be really making sure that we can do that. And I know there's lots of problems about not enough teachers who speak Welsh, but you know, problems are problems. You find solutions, don't you? And we've lost the ability to do that in Wales. And we'll talk about it later. You referred to, you know, Wales punching above its weight. Well, if we look historically, I mean, that is true in absolute space. You know, honestly, we have always been an incredibly impactful nation for our size and for the fact that, given that, you know, we haven't even been sovereign for the last 700 years.
In terms of my upbringing, probably one of the most English people you would ever meet, in the fact that I grew up in Dover. When I looked at my family tree over the pandemic, it was English for about 250 years on both sides. But I thought I was British, and then I came to Wales and I realised I was English. I'm getting to the point where, you know, if I fill out a form for like any sort of form, and there's an option of saying Welsh, I will pick that.
Yeah.
Because it's my home. It's been quite a journey for me personally to live here, and you know, I support the Welsh football team and the rugby team. Not so good at the moment, obviously, but you know, you can pick your teams and you can say, look, the Welsh women are doing very well, for example. So
one of the things that I don't think people are always fully cognizant of is the depth of difference between cultural attitudes between Wales and England. And is part of your becoming an adopted Welshman, or Welsh person, I should say, is part of that because you find yourself, your own personal cultural values, more in alignment with sort of historic long-term Welsh cultural values than some of those which have dominated in the English sphere and in the Anglosphere generally, but in England and further afield.
I feel more at home here, and I felt more welcome than I ever did growing up in Dover. And don't get me wrong, I had some really good friends, and you know, I'm very supported by my family and everything. But I always felt a bit like I was an outsider. So yeah, so it's been quite a turnaround for me. Also, I used to be very keen on the royal family and all of that sort of stuff, and that's sort of dissipated more now. But I suppose it's my questioning of the wider structures, the wider power structures that exist, and which is a discussion for another time, really. But yeah,
it is. I mean, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I have no beef against the royal family. I've met Prince Charles, as he was then, quite a few times. No beef against him either. But I have some quite fundamental, principled objections to a child being born with significantly higher status than another child just by virtue of who their parents are, and with some kind of divine right behind it. Just doesn't sit with me at all in any way, shape or form. So I'm afraid I am a Gwern Gwynfil in Welsh, a Republican.
Good. Could you tell us a few factoids about Wales and some things that might surprise our listeners?
Wales is the earliest nation in Europe to have recorded codified laws. So the laws of Hwyl in Wales is the earliest written system of codified laws. And what's particularly interesting about the laws of Hwyl and what speaks to that difference in culture between the Anglosphere and a nation like Wales is that if you look at the laws of Hwyl, they are incredibly equal and egalitarian. They give pretty much equal status to women as men, you know, with very little. So a woman can happily divorce a man for domestic abuse, for example. A woman could just divorce a man, which is, you know, this is 1,000 years ago and more. On the other hand, a man is allowed to divorce his wife if she disparages his beard, which is one of my favorite laws in there. But it's very equal. And even when it comes to provision for the separation of wealth between partners, you know, that egalitarian, equal sort of sense that there is no difference between men and women, or indeed, particularly between a werin bobl, the folk people, the regular people, and their leaders. And I think that's still there in much of Wales. I mean, there's been an attempt to impose the rigid class system of the Anglosphere in Wales. But really, there's only two classes in Wales. You know, there's the crachach and the werin, and that's it, which is, you know, effectively, I suppose, the aristocracy and the regular people, or the establishment and the regular people. So Hwyl, I think, is something we should be much prouder of. and something we should make much more of, and a defining difference that we should highlight. I'm going to talk about Henry Richard MP. He was a Liberal MP for Merthyr Tydfil back in the second half of the 19th century, because he's a hugely important and significant figure, particularly in campaigning for peace, global peace, even back in the 19th century. And also there's a massive statue of him on the square in Tregaron, and he's from Tregaron. And every morning when I would get up and look out of the window, I would see his head, because that's where his head was. On the first floor, when you looked out the window, you'd see Henry Richard standing there with his book, and he's big. But Henry Richard is important because he was the secretary of the Peace Society for almost 40 years. And during that time, he crisscrossed Europe, campaigning for peace and creating networks of like-minded people. He, in his lifetime, was called the Apostle for Peace. And there is a very decent argument to be made that it's his work that laid the foundations for what became the League of Nations and then subsequently the United Nations. And because the 19th century was such a small place with individual figures being so important and significant, you could make a very cogent argument for Henry Richard being the father of the United Nations. And yet we do none of that. And he's a forgotten guy from Tregaron, which is mad, absolutely mad, and he's not the only one. Robert Record invented the equal sign. How many kids get to hear that in maths when they're in primary school? There's a Welsh guy from North Wales. And then you've got people like Dr. Richard Price, who was massively important and influential in the founding of the United States of America. We don't really do enough. We don't talk about it enough. Here in Wales. And I'm going to give you a little fact. Wales is almost exactly the same size geographically as Slovenia.
Oh, how does the population compare? Is it a comparative country in that sense?
Very, very comparative. With the difference that Slovenia became independent in 1991 and was poorer than Wales at that time and is now significantly wealthier than Wales and on an upward trajectory. Across Europe, Slovenia is actually the most equal society in Europe economically in terms of wealth disparity, and also scores incredibly highly on well-being measurements as well.
I have to go on holiday to Slovenia.
No, you should definitely go on holiday to Slovenia. It's meant to be great. My brother's been there and he keeps telling me I should go, and I'd love to go. Another interesting thing about that is, it's been 34 years since they became independent. In that time, they've had centre-left governments, they've had centre-right governments, they've had the usual political scandals, corruption, all of those different things. And yet, despite all of that, despite all of those regular political shenanigans, they have still managed to flourish as a nation and to, improve the quality of life of the people of Slovenia, the general wealth and well-being of the nation. And part of that, I think, is just because within Slovenia, there's a shared vision of what Slovenia wants to become when it grows up, something Wales does not have.
So, in 1997, Wales voted by the narrowest of margins on a really small turnout too. I mean, basically, you've got 25% of the population or 25.1% of the population voting yes for devolution. So creating for the first time in centuries a Welsh legislature. And then in 1999, the Welsh Assembly opened and has since renamed the Senedd. And for our listeners who might not be aware, what is the purpose of the Senedd and what are the devolved powers given to the Welsh government? I say given, that's a telling sign in itself. But what are the powers?
So obviously, there's a lot to cover there. So I think I'll stick to headlines. So the Senedd, what is now the Senedd, is an evolution of what was the Assembly. And the Assembly really didn't have a great deal of power. We need to understand this. There was an awful lot that it could not do. The Senedd can do a little bit more. Obviously, there are devolved areas, the highlights of which are probably health and education, culture and a few other things, but the truth is that it's a very patchy devolution settlement. And I know we're going to talk about the Constitutional Commission later, so I won't go into too much of that now because we will cover that. But that patchiness of devolution, in stark contrast to the Scottish settlement, which started off at a much higher level with much more devolution of power and has since gained even further devolution of other powers, and is much more like a real government than Wales. And I'm sure the MSs in the Senedd would not be pleased at me saying that it's not a real government. But in many ways it isn't, because so many things are out of its purview and out of its control. And an awful lot of things don't work for that very reason, because you have a very disjointed way of implementing change. So it's like having a jigsaw where the pieces don't match. You're never going to be able to finish that puzzle or make that puzzle even look half decent because you haven't got all the right pieces to put into it. And to just put that in perspective in terms of those devolved, a couple of facts that are going to put this in perspective for you. So the Welsh Senedd gets a budget of around 25 billion a year. More than half of that, currently 56% of that, is spent on health. So, you know, of all the money that comes into Wales, what you're really talking about is you've got a Senedd which is responsible for health plus a few other things. I mean, there are other issues around health. That proportion has risen an awful lot. It used to be less than 40%, and now it's over 50%. So there's that further challenge. But it's a restrictive and clumsy and inadequate bodge job of devolution, really. I mean that's the truth. It's an inadequate settlement. And when you get people criticising the devolutionary settlement because it doesn't work and criticising the Welsh government because they're inadequate and they don't do enough, some of those criticisms are fair. And, you know, the Labour government has been effectively in charge in Wales for 25 years. It's not always been as full of talent as it might have been. It's not always had the clarity of purpose that it might have had. It certainly hasn't always had the bravery to stand up to Westminster and demand more in ways that it should. I think that's evident today. But at the same time, many of the things that have tied the hands of Welsh government and of the Senedd are structural and systemic. So it isn't within its capacity to do those things. So that's where we are with devolution. It's one of the reasons we want to establish New Wales, is to talk about these things in greater depth and talk about them in ways that a wider swathe of the public can understand and appreciate and engage with. I don't think this is definitely a failing of Welsh government and of the Senedd across the entire 25 years, 26 years now. They have never, ever truly put their minds to communicating to the Welsh public what they do, how they do it, and what they can and can't do well. And that lack of education is really showing 26 years on.
What do you think devolution's brought to Wales that is positive?
So one of the things I think it's brought is, it's quite ephemeral really, but it's brought a sense of identity, and it has fed into that slow growth in confidence. So my eldest son is 25. He's the same age as the Welsh government. And it would never, you know, the things that might have been divisions between myself as a 25-year-old and as 25-year-olds from the valleys or from North Wales or from D-side within Wales just don't exist for his generation. You know, that sense of unity in a Welsh context for children born in Wales and brought up in Wales during the period of the Assembly and then the Senedd, it is very different. They have a very different understanding and appreciation of Wales and Wales's place in the world. And it allows them to be more confident about Wales outside of Wales. And it's a really interesting and striking thing that so many of Josh's generation and younger have told me that they don't really understand and appreciate Wales until the day that they leave and come back. And as soon as they leave and face, you know, the kind of prejudice that you get and the kind of mockery that you often perceive, particularly in England across the border, but also when you go abroad and people treat you differently when they understand you're from Wales and not from England, they suddenly come to realise how deeply a part of them it is and how much pride they can have in where they're from and how much it is part of their identity and how that identity unites them in what has become a very global world with instantaneous communication from every corner of the globe. It makes them special, and being Welsh makes them special. And that's much more understood and appreciated. And it doesn't matter how much you might disagree with someone else from Wales, being Welsh as they are, you're special together, even if you hate each other. And that is it. And like I say, it's ephemeral, but it is a qualitative difference in the experience of Joshua's generation relative to mine. Terrible oversimplification, but essentially we're 10 years behind Scotland. And if you look at the demographic data and polling in Scotland on things like identity and these sorts of things, which, as you know, Tom, I do an awful lot of. I'm a bit of a data nerd. You can track that we're about 10 years behind. And when we come to talk about politics, that's going to be really interesting because we're coming to a point where Plaid Cymru might do what the SNP did around 10 years ago. Are we going to keep shadowing that 10-year delay in that way? And are the Labour Party in Wales going to shadow the 10-year delay for the Labour in Scotland? Labour in Scotland did exactly the wrong thing after the SNP stuffed them and destroyed themselves. Are Labour in Wales going to do that? Are they going to double down on being Keir Starmer's Labour, or will they do something else? And will it tear them apart? Because definitely a lot of tension within the Welsh Labour Party and the Welsh Labour infrastructure right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can talk about it now because the Senedd elections will be in May 2026. And I won't go in too much detail for our listeners about this, but there's going to be increased membership of the Senedd from 60 members to 96. There's a change in the voting system and how... So basically, you move from picking an individual to voting for a party. You don't know who your candidate is going to be until all the results come through. So if there was an election...
You'll sort of know because the people on top of the list are more than likely to get elected. And there's been a lot of negativity around the closed list system and around this part of the electoral reform. And I do understand that. And I'm personally a fan of single transferable vote as opposed to this kind of system. But it's not an unknown system. So the London Assembly uses this closed list system. So it's not even an unknown system within the UK. And there's lots of places, Portugal, Spain, other places that use closed list systems. And there are ways for parties to ameliorate the lack of democracy within that. And the biggest accusation is, while parties can control who gets elected and, they will make sure that they get people who listen to them and toe the line. They won't get people who maybe force them to be more open, have broader discussions. But what's different about that today than has ever been? I mean, that's always been the way, party central infrastructures, whoever's the leadership of any party is at a given time, try and push their preferred candidates, those candidates that are in favour. I would love to see a Welsh party be bold enough to have open primaries for their own candidate selection. And I mean really open primaries, not even within the party, but outside the party too. But I don't think that we're going to get that kind of democracy from any of the parties, however much they profess to love democracy, because they won't see it as being in their own interests. So I don't think we should be overly concerned about the closed list system. I don't think it'll last very long. As soon as the election concludes in 26, we're immediately going to be revising the constituencies, because it's, these have been constructed expediently on the basis of the general election constituencies. So it will be very different as soon as we get to 2030. But it's very interesting. It's a very interesting election because it is a radical change in Wales.
Yeah, and it's because you've got more members, and then it's a different experience for the voter. Culturally, for the parties, it's going to be a massive shift. It's difficult to say now what would happen, but if there was an election tomorrow, what would the breakdown be between the parties?
So I'm going to stick my neck out for you here, Tom, and I'm actually going to make a prediction for 26. Okay. I'm going to stick my neck right out.
Got your bets in after this,
and Plaid Cymru will be the biggest party. Yeah, they have momentum. They have the most popular leader in Wales. He's a good media performer. They've improved their ground game. They've cleaned themselves up after some troublesome times. They have a relatively clear message, and I think they will get probably 30 seats, possibly even 30 plus seats. So they will be the largest party, and will come out of that, because of the way they're talking about it now, will be the winners, because they're not saying that they're going to get 30 seats. They're not claiming that they're going to be the largest party. So they will be the winners. We have this added element now of, the surge in reform support in Wales. And I think however well reform do in 26, they're going to be the nominal losers, because they've been saying that they're going to get 40 seats and be the party of government. Well, they're not. It's just not going to happen. I think they could get 20, 21, 22 unless they begin to fall apart. But, they've been working hard on professionalizing themselves and having a better turnout. And they've definitely understood the new system. The new system is not about targeting individual seats. These are giant constituencies. And all you need in a single constituency is 12% of the vote to get one seat. So if you get 12% of the vote in 16 constituencies, you've got your 16 seats as a baseline. And I think that is well within the reach of reform if they can get their vote out, because your most likely reform voter is the person most likely to not bother to vote in a Senedd election, but vote in a general election. So, but I do think that they can get between 16 and 20. I think the traditional parties, both Tories and Labour, are going to lose badly. Labour are going to be hamstrung by their record, hamstrung by the fact that there's a Westminster government, which is going to be, it's going to be midterm blues anyway, and they're already incredibly unpopular. So they've got everything against them. Plus, internally, they're fighting like rats in a sack, and it's not a happy party in any way, shape, or form, and that's going to impact it. They're dropping like flies. Over a third of the sitting MSs are coming down, so they're going to go. As you know, I wrote a provocative piece winding up the Lib Dems and the Greens, saying that what they should do is create an alliance, and that's on a purely data-driven, pragmatic approach. That would give them a fighting chance of getting 12 to 16 seats. As things stand, I genuinely think that the Lib Dems could be wiped out in 26. They could well get 0 seats. I don't think they're understanding at all how the system has changed. I don't think they're getting that. And I don't think they're understanding either that even in their sort of heartland Powys, even there, because of the way things will break down, because you have 6 parties and the way things will break down, they could well get pushed out of the 6th seat, even there. So, and they do have some good campaigners. They do have some prospects, but, even in a best case scenario, 2 or 3 seats for them and potentially 0. I think we need to, I think they need to think very long and hard about that. Another surprise entrant, I think, is the Greens. I think the Greens will do far better than people might expect, partly because they have a realistic chance of having seats. So a vote for the Green Party isn't a wasted vote anymore. So a lot of people who would like to vote for the Green Party as a point of principle and haven't, because what's the point, can do so in this election with a realistic prospect that if the Greens can get up to 8, 9, 10% of the vote on a pan-Wales basis, they could pick up 5 to 8 seats. So I think there'll be a surprise coming into it. And that's more or less the way that I think the dice will fall at the moment. Obviously, a year is a long time in politics and a lot of things can change. But what that means is the result of this, there's 2 really interesting outcomes. In that 96-seat new Senedd, more than half, inevitably, more than half of the new MSs are going to be brand new. So it's going to be a very inexperienced and very different chamber, which is one thing. It will have members of Reform in it, and the experience of having members of UKIP as, not even as disruptors, but as wreckers, inexperienced wreckers, does not augur well for a smooth running of governance and government in Wales, in the Senedd, for the 26 to 30 term. And the other thing is it's going to be incredibly difficult to create a functioning government. I don't think we're going to be on Belgian levels of 18 months of haggling before a government is formed, but there is going to be an incredible challenge there. Labour will be very reluctant to be second fiddle to Plaid after being in power for 25 years. They also won't know how to react to losing for the first time. They'll be pulled one way by their MPs in Wales, which will be towards the centre of gravity in London. But the MSs may want to pull in a different direction, which is going to create rifts. And there probably won't be electoral mathematics that gives a majority easily in other ways. So it's going to be quite chaotic for a while after the election, I expect. So there you go, nail killers to the mast. On my current sort of, that's how I see things panning out at the moment.
And did you mention the Conservatives in there as well?
Yeah, they're going to do quite badly. I mean, for different reasons to Labour, but also some similar reasons, internal conflicts, issues, poor leadership. But for them as well, a lot of their support is being siphoned to Reform.
Okay.
And so that's going to have an impact on them. Again, though, I mean, if they focus and get 12 to 14% across Wales or in every constituency, they get 16 seats. The electoral maths for the kind of split that we have under this daunt system is absolutely fascinating. And no one is as far as I can tell, very few people are working through the implications, because the inertia of how elections have been fought for so long is so deeply ingrained in their internal party systems that they can't see how much things have changed. It isn't a factor for reform, because reform are coming in freshly and are just doing it.
Fresh eyes. And they have a lot more energy behind them, and a pretty young group of people supporting them too, right? In terms of the people that are working in reform, I mean, it's quite a dynamic operation.
It is. They've got money and they're putting some structure together. They have some fundamental issues, though. The Welsh membership and support of reform, people like Oliver Lewis, are really the left of centre social conservatives. But the leadership of Reform UK are not left of centre social conservatives. And Nigel Farage himself is potentially a huge weakness for reform in Wales. I mean, Nigel Farage is a national populist conservative who believes in the privatisation of the NHS. He's an extreme libertarian. These are not things that appeal to the people who are saying that they will vote for him in Wales. They don't have a leader in Wales. They're going to go into the election without anybody as a front man. They're going to try and play on Nigel Farage, who is, on a UK-wide basis, the most popular politician in the UK, but only with a 28% approval rate. 62% still dislike him. He's the most popular person in an incredibly unpopular field. And in Wales, I would say that Rhyn ap Iorwerth is going to be more popular than Nigel Farage. I mean, the attack on Nigel Farage is so easy. He's not even Welsh. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about Wales. He wants to privatise the NHS. Who in Wales wants to privatise the NHS? And they can't dress that up. They can't hide it. And they can't hide. They might get away with it for 2026, but they cannot hide the fundamental policy and ideology gulfs between Reform UK. I mean, Reform UK really, in a constitutional basis, is all about a greater England. They're not interested in Wales and Scotland. That's their natural ideological position. Well, that's not going to sit well with a left of centre person and Welsh person in the valleys who identifies as a Welsh person, but is incredibly socially conservative and angry with the Labour Party and angry about everything. So the anger will carry them through maybe 26, but that's not going to keep you going. It's not going to give you deep roots and a real sort of focus and base in Wales.
Last year, the Independent Commission for the Constitutional Future of Wales, co-chaired by Professor Laura McAllister and the Right Rev and Right Honourable Dr. Ryan Williams, published its findings to set out three potential options for Wales to take in the future. The first being enhanced devolution, the second being a federal UK, and then the third being an independent Wales. And some of those, the listeners, that might seem like alien sort of concepts. So enhanced devolution being a reformed second chamber in Parliament, in the Westminster Parliament, to provide representation of devolved nations, a comprehensive review of national and regional funding. As you've referred to, devolution across the UK is very uneven. And then new processes for updating the powers of the Senedd. The second arrangement would be a federal arrangement for Wales, so a written constitution, because currently the UK has an unwritten constitution, to define the distribution of powers at each level of government in England, or the regions in England, and would have its own parliament, so an English parliament, formal representation of the nations and regions at a UK level, for example, in a reformed second chamber. And then the third option being an independent Wales, that the Senedd and the Welsh Government would be responsible for all aspects of government. Wales would apply to join outside organisations like United Nations and international organisations.
First, I'm going to track you back to the bit of the Constitutional Commission's report that came before that, which was its immediate recommendations.
Okay.
And the immediate recommendations were phrased as being absolutely essential for the effective functioning of devolution and for the government and governance of Wales. And some of those are repeated recommendations that we saw in 2014 in the Silk Commission. But those recommendations were very explicitly and very forcefully said, particularly by Laura and Rowan when they've been speaking about it afterwards. Those things that are absolutely essential just for Wales to function properly and to fix the flaws in the existing devolution settlement. I mean, one of them was to formalise the informal tenets of the Sewell Convention.
The Sewell Convention means that the UK Parliament usually won't make laws on issues that are handled directly by the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Senedd or the Northern Ireland Assembly, unless that devolved body agrees through a formal vote called a legislative consent motion.
That breakdown in the relationship between Welsh Government and Westminster during the Boris Johnson era in particular couldn't happen again because Boris Johnson just ignored the Sewell Convention and there was a significant breakdown in relationships. And that's not good for anyone. And then, financial controls. At the moment, the Welsh Government doesn't really have any financial controls. So there's, Wales is already underfunded. The Barnett formula, I wrote quite a long explainer about the Barnett formula.
The Barnett formula is a method used by the UK government to calculate how much funding to give to devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's used to determine how the block grants given to those administrations change from year to year.
It's been around forever. It was thrown together as a patch. The person who created it has long since said that it's no longer fit for purpose, and yet the Barnett formula is still being used. It favours Scotland. Scotland does very well out of the Barnett formula relative to Wales. Wales does very badly and is constantly underfunded as a result. So, things like that are just not good enough. And then on top of that, because we don't have any adequate financial controls, when Wales, as in the past, been frugal and managed to preserve some of its budget for future use, at the end of the year, that money's been taken back by the Treasury. So the Treasury has just taken money back from Wales, a place where it's already not giving enough money and not even giving a just amount of money. So these things are considered essential and immediate changes. By the way, none of these things have happened. So the report has been out now for over a year and none of these things are being happened and no one's really talking about them. For me, it's a huge failing of this Welsh Labour government with a Welsh Labour government in Westminster that they're not pushing these 10 recommendations aggressively and insisting upon them. Devolution of broadcasting, why don't we have devolution of broadcasting? We've been talking about it again forever and ever and ever. The media in Wales is anemic. It is not bold and brave. And when you compare it again with Scotland and the much braver and more substantial media that they have there. Why can't Wales have a media like that? Iceland, 380,000 people, has a daily newspaper. It has about 25 TV channels. Some of them are sports channels, but 5 of them are two are public funded, 3 are just private, and they make money. 380,000 people. There's newspapers there that make money. If you can make money in a place in a nation that's the same size as Cardiff, with a thriving media, why can Wales not have its own thriving media? Well, probably because the infrastructure isn't there to allow the media to thrive, or an independent media to thrive in Wales. Energy, that's another one. That was one that was called upon. Again, it's not devolved. So energy in Wales is really problematic because Welsh Government is trying to do things in the energy sector around its responsibility for the economy, but it can't because energy isn't devolved. So you get this really odd patchwork, this jigsaw again, with all these pieces that don't fit together properly. And because pieces don't fit together properly, it just causes waste and inadequate solutions. And it's just incredibly frustrating for everyone, including energy companies. It's just frustrating for everyone. Justice and policing. These two were the ones that were in Paul Silk's report in 2014. As categoric recommendations. 10 years on, we're repeating the recommendation and no one's talking about it. There's some vague lip service to the devolution of youth justice. And that's it. But policing and justice. All of a sudden, Wales then has more capacity to do things in a holistic way and to change things in ways that improve the lives of the people of Wales. I mean, these things, they sound so dry, don't they? They sound so technical and dry and constitutional and unimportant. But what people don't understand is that these are the avenues, these are the systems, and this is the infrastructure that allows you to improve people's day-to-day lives at a ground level in villages and towns across Wales. So they're really important, but we don't talk about them enough. And then the last one was rail services and infrastructure. This one's incredibly notorious at the moment because of HS2. There's a bit of a blame game because the Welsh Labour government could have taken these years ago. It was offered and they said no. But you can't, there's no point pointing the finger. Okay, you didn't take advantage then. You didn't have the bravery and boldness then. But look, it's categoric now. We should have this. So let's just do it. Let's put our hands up and insist. So all of those things were considered immediately essential in that Constitutional Commission report. 2 years of research, building on lots of other research, a cross-party consensus, which is an amazing achievement for that Constitutional Commission. Every single person on that Constitutional Commission agreed with all of these recommendations, whether they were a Tory or Plaid or Liberal, or Labour, all of them. And yet, this isn't being shouted out and being put front of centre of Welsh Government demands on a weekly basis. And it should be. The system is broken. We can fix it. You can help us by giving us these and doing it now in a sensible way. I mean, you can't just instantly devolve justice and policing, for example, because you're going to need some run into that. But if it's going to happen, you can start to plan it now and you can start to fund it and you can start to do it. So all of those things, for me, are more important than the three longer-term options. But the three longer-term options are enormously important in terms of one of the main goals of what New Wales wants to do, which is to try and create a cross-party vision of the Wales we want to become. Because at the moment, I don't feel that in the political sphere in Wales, there is a shared vision of a future Wales. And it's visible by its absence. If you asked Welsh politicians, well, what's Wales going to be like in 25 years? What's the Wales we want in 25 years? When my 8-year-old is 33, what kind of Wales is he going to be living in? Oh, I'm not sure. Because I don't think any of them will have an answer for that. And the very few who may have an answer, maybe 10 to 15% of the MSs who might have thought about it, will probably not have the same answer. So we can't even argue about how we get to where we're going because we don't know where we're going. So we argue about all sorts of inconsequential stuff. And, the sin becomes that horrible thing, an empty, vacuous talking shop far too often. Or it gets lost in detail without thinking about the greater vision for the nation. And you have to have that high-level vision, as well as, the finicky detail of sorting things out. And we don't have it, and we need it. And that's where the three possible futures that are in the Constitutional Commission come in. And they were very explicit. The Constitutional Commission was very explicit about wanting to hand that baton over for others to take it and run further with it. And all of those would work. That's the thing. I mean, they would work. We need to know what we want to do as a nation and how we want to do it and what's possible, because I don't think federalism will ever come about, because I don't feel that Westminster will ever be willing to dissipate sovereignty in that way. And you can imagine how the populist right would react to the dissipation of sovereignty within the British sphere. And, it would be internal Brexit all over again, wouldn't it? And I think, there's a potential there that what would happen is support for English independence would rocket, and you'd quite quickly get to a situation where there was more support in England for English independence than there is in Wales for Welsh independence. And suddenly Wales finds itself out on its arse because England has decided to be independent. Or worse yet, you get that Greater England environment, which I don't think will work well for Wales. Wales is an afterthought if you're in Westminster. You've got plenty to think about. You've got 650 MPs and, and a nation of 55 million people in England to deal with. And 3 million people out on the Western fringes. Oh, God, they're just causing trouble again. So you don't deal with it or address it. And you're not going to deal with it or address it until that 3 million people start to cause you trouble by being rude and obstreperous and insisting and, not behaving. And in Wales, we're very good at behaving ourselves and keeping our heads down and not making as much noise as we should.
Finally, you've set up a think tank plus.
Yes.
Called New Wales. Could you tell us a little bit about it? You've sort of referenced it through our conversation so far, and the purpose of New Wales.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of New Wales is to have a new cross-party forum for discussing all of the things that we've discussed today, actually researching things, and in researching things, doing it far more broadly than existing think tanks and existing policy units in Wales might do, or policy units that are restricted because they're within the establishment. But we don't have a body that is willing to research things that you may never want to embrace, but you need to know what you're not doing as well as what you're doing to make a truly informed decision. And we don't necessarily do that. And the other thing we don't do is communicate the research more widely. And that's why I call it a think tank plus. The idea is that it doesn't just rely on talking within the bubble in Cardiff Bay, or talking to policymakers, or lobbying for policy change, or providing new policy ideas, which is a hugely important thing to do, and something which we do need to do. And we definitely need to do it outside the social policy sector. Well, there's a lot of work in the social policy sector in Wales. So the one area that I would say that New Wales probably won't engage with is the social policy area, because it's so comprehensively covered by a vast array of bodies in Wales. But we don't have people really doing the economic research. We don't have people doing the constitutional stuff. We don't have people doing energy and broadcasting. We don't have that persistent voice of doing those things, or of being willing to be controversial in looking at those things. Not even in the education sector. We don't really have anybody, pushing for innovation, genuine innovation in the education sector, even though Wales has centuries of tradition and history in innovating in education. And I would love to lead on that particular thing. You might have gathered that I've got an interest in education. And in an ideal scenario, we will secure some resources for New Wales as it evolves and grows. And if I do stay involved, which I hope to, I'll be able to just focus on that education part in terms of my own research and contributions, whilst other people take the lead in other places. Another thing that we're very keen to do, and we have one of our sort of founder members is out in Canada. We're really hoping to engage the Welsh diaspora with this conversation, because, unlike other nations, I don't think Wales has historically been very good at engaging with its outside Wales Welsh population. Ireland and Scotland are actually pretty good at talking to Irish and Scottish diasporas and engaging with them and bringing funding and contributions from them. Whereas in Wales, we're not very good at that. So I'm hoping that Simon, who's out in Canada, he's out in Quebec, I'm hoping that he will be able to work through organizations like Global Welsh, who are already engaging with this diaspora, work with a wider array of people to have their voices contributing to that vision for Wales. And I have no doubt that for that Welsh diaspora, many of them in very different cultures, they'll have very different perceptions and visions for Wales than those which the current establishment in Wales might consider palatable or desirable. But having them express those and contribute those ideas might help give clarity to those within positions of power in Wales, where often at the moment there's woolliness in their thinking. And obviously, as you know, this is Wales, and the Welsh way of doing things is a certain way. I'm not going to be popular. New Wales isn't going to be popular, because this is not done in Wales. Sticking your head above the parapet and saying, well, sorry guys, what we're doing isn't good enough, is not popular in Wales. Coming in with the attitude of our fundamental core focus in New Wales is to ask the question, how can we do this better, is not a popular position. But I figure that I've already got a huge target on my back, so I may as well just make it bigger. Our starting point as well, constitutionally, just referring back, and I think we're explicit about this in our current About Us, is the conclusions that were put forward by the Constitutional Commission. In that sense, we're explicitly looking to build on where they've got us to, so that their report doesn't just lie on a shelf gathering dust. And we'll be discussing that. Our launch event is on April the 2nd in y Senedd, at 6 p.m. As this is the 1st of March, dydd Gwyl hapus pawb sy'n gwrando. The tickets will be live as of today on Eventbrite. So if you log it, they're free. And there will be booze. You get to come along. As of today, we have David Melding, the former Conservative MS and director of the Fed Trust, who obviously has very interesting, he's a dyed-in-the-wool unionist by his own confession, but is a very keen proponent of federalism. So he's going to be on the panel. Paul Silk, of the chair of the Silk Commission, is also going to be on the panel for us, unless he's been called away to an engagement in Baghdad, which will make it hard for him to show up in Cardiff as well. But hopefully that clash won't happen and he will be there. You will have to tolerate me talking for about 3 or 4 minutes, but I'll literally be introducing people and then getting out of the way. It's going to be an opportunity to ask searching questions of the panelists, as opposed to an opportunity for the panelists to lay out their existing positions.
Great. Well, we'll make sure to promote all the links and everything for that as well. But yeah, thanks for being an excellent guest, and happy St. David's Day. And that concludes our first episode of Season 2 of Spare a Thought. My thanks to Gwern for being such an excellent guest. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afrocluster, Magugu and Asher Jane. The show was researched, written and edited by me, Tom Spare, with additional editing and production by Lucy Yachelik. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.